Hey, David Brewster here, new episode of Chordplay, and this is the Chords of Psychedelic Rock, and it was a few weeks ago when I made the Psychedelic Blues Rock rant lesson, and the feedback and response I had from that video was very positive. I had lots of viewers thanking me for exposing them to bands and music that they'd never heard before, and I had requests for more psychedelic music, and that's why I'm making this episode. Psychedelic rock and psychedelic music's really interesting. It definitely exploded somewhere around 1965. Even though years before that it was kind of percolating and starting to kind of rise to the surface. But definitely groups like the Yardbirds, the Byrds, the Beatles, 13th Floor Elevators, and a whole bunch of different artists. Hendrix, of course, the Doors, Janis Joplin, there's tons. They helped, kind of usher in this style of music. And most historians or musical experts, claim that psychedelic rock ended around 1969. But I disagree with that. I think it kind of extended into the early 70s. Some of these bands and artists didn't really get the memo that it was over. But you got to think, the Beatles broke up in 70. Jimi Hendrix died in 1970. Janis Joplin also passed that year. Jim Morrison died in 1971. So those four events really did kind of signal the end of this style of music, even though it's continued. And there's like this retro kind of, psychedelic action, in more recent music. You can definitely hear it in pop and rock and different styles of music. But I'm mainly talking about that original, explosion of this music. Really did kind of take place from 65 to about 71. So if you're looking for a good album to kind of get started and explore psychedelic rock and psychedelic music, I highly recommend the Nuggets compilation that I have on the wall right there. That's a great one with 27 songs, and it will definitely steer your ears and fingers 27 different directions. And that'll kind of help you get kind of your footing, at least, and kind of understand the style and the sound. And from there, of course, you can dive deeper. But that's a great album to check out if you want to dive into psychedelic music and psychedelic rock. So the chord-based and rhythm guitar parts in this lesson came from 7 classic and not so classic psychedelic rock albums. And I did dive into this style, and I was pulling out bands that are kind of lesser known or kind of, obscure, mainly because, the greats like the Yardbirds and the Beatles and Hendrix and Pink Floyd and the Doors and Janis Joplin and the gang, Jefferson Airplane, of course, they've soaked up all the attention, or all the history, I guess. But there are hundreds and hundreds of other bands, a lot of them you probably never heard, some of them only had one album, that are really cool, very inspired music, even though it's kind of buried in today's world and you don't really hear about these bands or artists. There's some great music to be found, and here are the album covers where the music from this lesson came from. The opening, that was me playing around with the song Three Sisters from the band Affinity, and Affinity only had one album, their 1970 debut, which was self-titled, and they had a female vocalist. Linda Hoyle was her name. I think she was an English teacher, but they selected her as the vocalist. It kind of reminds me of Janis Joplin a little bit. It doesn't really sound like Janis or Big Brother and the Holding Company, but it's probably just the psychedelic rock with the female vocalist that kind of reminds me of Janis a bit. Cool song though, like this. So it starts with a single note riff, like that. So that G to B flat and then that C. And then you're doing this E flat to C, D to C, like that. And then the Hendrix chord right there, a C7 sharp 9. Then do that single note riff again. Then you're doing this kind of funky, it's like, you know, like a dyad, like that. Like that. Then we switch to power chords there, that A flat, B flat to C. Like that. Do that 3 times to end up on this F to G, and then start banging out that G. And then the entire band just starts rocking out on that G. And it goes right back to the opening riff again. Something like that. Check out that Affinity album though, it's really cool, and I think that song's actually about witches and like witchcraft or something, but cool song. Next up's the song Sweet Talkin Woman from the band December's Children, and December's Children only had one album that was also released in 1970, and it was self-titled. And this is this funky kind of blues rock thing like this. Something like that. So we're starting in G, and he's doing this kind of dyad double stop thing, like that. And then you're doing the minor to major third, you know, hammer on right there in G, and then come down that G, F to D, and do all that again. And then right there, he's going from the minor to major third, you know, double stop, and then end abruptly on that F. Something like that. And do it again. And then just stay with that regular riff and don't end with that F note, and just keep repeating that. That's basically the verse right there. Then right there we're going up a whole step, we're going to A, and now we're doing that. Right? So just move the whole thing up a whole step and you've got... And it goes in the chorus right there. But I dig the way it started in G and we were doing that abrupt end on F. Then it moved through all that, you know, repetitive parts, and then it moves into A, and it ends with an abrupt, you know, A, ending on that G. That's pretty crafty, and that's cool to see riffs like that, where they kind of answer each other in a way. Next up's the song Freedom from the band Wizard, and this is from their self-titled 1971 album, and it was their only album, and definitely an obscure band, but that album's actually a kind of a collector's choice for psychedelic rock fans. And Freedom's something like this. Short and sweet here, it's not really hard to play either. Just a Hendrix chord there in E, E7 sharp 9, bang it and then slide it off. Kind of a pause right there, and then 2 Ds to 2 As. And and then do that Hendrix slide again, or the Hendrix chord slide, I guess, and then 2 Ds, 2 As. And then there's a low E right before the Hendrix chord. And then you got the single note riff on the low E and A string. Like that A to B, and then D, E, D to the open A. And then bang on the D to A chords again. Like that. Nothing really hard happening there, but that's a cool album. Check out that Wizard album from '71. It rocks. Next up, the song Thor The Thunder God. This is from the band The Open Mind from their 1969 self-titled debut album, and The Open Mind only had one album. And this is cool. It definitely has that 60s psychedelic kind of flavor to it, like this. Hard to play at all. E minor, strummed, and let it ring. And then while that's ringing, you're going to do this E, F sharp, G, F sharp kind of single note melody. Right? You're kind of going up and down right there. E, F sharp, G, F sharp to E. And then go to a B, a power chord right there and mash on that. Do that first part again, the E minor with the single note melody. But when you listen to it, you can hear the chord still ringing while you're doing that single note melody. So that's kind of an additional challenge right there. Keep those ringing strings ringing while you play, those single notes right there. Something like that. That's hard to do. Deceptively hard to do because you have to really watch out for those other strings that are still ringing. Anyway, you got that B. Do all that again. And then right there, you're going to grab that B, and then you start sliding that B flat into B. And the verse right there, E minor to A major, and then that slid B flat to B, chord like that. Definitely has that classic 60s psychedelic sound. Check out The Open Mind. Next up's the song Elegy from the band Colosseum. This came from their album Valentine Suite from 1969. And Colosseum definitely is a band that had more of a history compared to some of the bands we've looked at so far. Actually, John Heisman eventually left this group and formed Colosseum 2 with Gary Moore. And I did feature Colosseum 2 at the beginning of this month, so if you didn't watch that Chordplay episode, get your butt over there and watch it because Gary Moore is in that lesson. But anyway, Colosseum is a really interesting band. And Elegy has got this kind of funky thing going like this. Something like that. So it's this like kind of, abrupt strumming and muting, and it's super funky too though. Check this song out. And this is a G minor 7 to A minor 7 like that. Like that. That goes back and forth several times. Then eventually you hear that C minor 7 to a D minor 7 like that. Then back to the G minor 7, A minor 7 again. right there, it moves out to a B flat 7. And they start kind of almost doing like this gallop rhythm. And then do that same rhythm on A minor 7, G minor 7. And then a quick change, that C minor 7, D minor 7 with that same kind of gallop. And then right back to the funky. Really interesting song, interesting band too, and Valentine Suite's definitely a classic psychedelic prog rock, jazz rock album. You gotta check that one out. Next up's the band Pretty Things with their song Barren Saturday from their 1968 album SF Sorrow. And this is an interesting band. Definitely Pretty Things had a longer career in history compared to some of the bands we've looked at so far. 1965 until around 1976, and they broke up. And they reformed in 79 and continued, or something like that. But this is cool. It reminds me of the Beatles, like this. I actually repeated that part twice so you could really kind of catch what was going on, because this song wanders all over the place. It starts doing all that kind of stuff in the beginning, and then eventually it starts banging out that part. Piano and guitar and everybody's rocking out. Hendrix chord once again, C7 sharp 9 right there, and you're literally just banging it out. Take that shape, move it over a set of strings. Now it's a G7 right there, and bang that out. You know, exact same shape. Now move it back to C and do it again in C for that C7 sharp 9. Back to G7 right there. Then we start moving around. C7 right there. E flat 7 right there. Then a B flat 7 like the G7 we had, but right there. Take that, move it all the way down to F, and now you got an open string in there too. That's really interesting. And then I basically repeated that twice, but that's a cool riff, and I dig the funky piano and the kind of Beatles-esque kind of sound. That's a cool one. Okay, last but not least is the band Nazz with their song Open My Eyes from their 1968 self-titled album. Nazz released 3 albums in their career. They also had Todd Rundgren on guitar. I did feature this song in the Todd Rundgren's Chordplay. I guess that was about a year ago now. But Open My Eyes rocks out like this. Something like that. So we're starting with these chord hits, big time right there. Like that. So we're basically doing, you know, E major right there. And there's part of G major 7 right there. And then it's part of D major 7 over A. And then it's part of E major over B right there. So when you listen to that intro part with those chord hits, you hear a guitar and like some kind of a funky like electric piano or a keyboard, and it's kind of hard to make out who played what, but that's what you hear, like the tonalities that happen with the guitar and keyboard together. And I'm not sure if I actually showed it that way in the Todd Rundgren Chordplay. I may have just played power chords in that lesson, but when you really listen to it and analyze it, it's like, no, that's E major to G major 7 to that D major 7 over A, and then that E major over B, like that. And that's the opening part. Then you hear a single note riff like this. So a big slide, and then that A, F sharp, G, G sharp, and then A sharp, B, D, D sharp, E. Like that. Then you hear a harmony of that part right here. It's just octaves right there, but when you put those together, Open My Eyes rocks, Todd Rundgren rocks, and that Nazz album kicks ass for sure. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with this look at the chords of psychedelic rock. Definitely a very interesting style of music to explore if you've never really dove into this before. And for those of you that are aware of these bands and albums and songs, then you know kind of what I'm talking about here. But if this is new to you, even though this music is, 50, 60 years old or more, it's going to seem fresh. It's going to seem different. There's a lot of experimentation, a lot of musical chances being taken with chords and guitar tones and effects and stuff. And you got to think, like, the rock and roll 50s definitely put rock and roll on the map, but then the 60s, things really became experimental and kind of trippy and psychedelic and whatnot. And by the end of that decade, I mean, you had all these artists, all these bands, all these different ideas floating around. People were growing out beards and playing sitar and all kinds of stuff, where it's like, where did this come from? And then almost as soon as it appeared, it disappeared. And like by the mid-70s, all of that was considered like old hat and like old 60s stuff. And a lot of bands moved away from that style and sound. But then it resurfaced, like somewhere in the 80s, like there was some psychedelic kind of, like classic retro kind of tributes and stuff like that. The Beatles had a big resurgence, in the 80s for sure. And then over the years, like the 90s, there was definitely psychedelic action and bands kind of whipping out this stuff. And so it's interesting to notice like when it started and erupted, and then you kind of see it like pop up again, or it repeats again, where it's like, hey, like 20 years later, it was cool again. And there's just something about exploring this music and these albums and these bands and learn a little bit more about this history. And it's also really cool to notice like the connections that some of these bands I featured here, the way they're connected to other bands and like rock and roll history. It's really cool. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.